It is Sunday night. Ches ein letes tevis. Hey Tofshin Pevov. And we're doing the fourth shir on the Mamer Basi Ligani Tofshin Chavov. You know how these things work. When I finish giving all the shurim on the Mamer, I'm ready to give the shurim on the Mamer. But kacha. That's how Teda goes. So first of all, the shir is a schus for the four Shlema, for Yenison ben Tzipeda, Yankiv Dave ben Pnina, Chayim Mushka Bashtan Nesara, Yankiv ben Etel, Arsen ben Zoya, Dave ben Talia, Moshe ben Binyamin, Moshe Yenison ben Tzipeda, Teva bas Fega, Elon ben Ira. Yes. The shir is chus for the four Shlema, for Yenison ben Tzipeda, and Yankiv Dave ben Pnina, and Chayim Mushka Bashtan Nesara, and Yankiv ben Etel, and Arsen ben Zoya, and Dov ben Talia, Moshe ben Binyamin, Moshe Yenison ben Sipoira, Teva bas Fega, Elon ben Ira, Elon ben Shimshon, Yehuda Leib ben Manya, Shoshana bas Menet, Levi Zev ben Elishev Rochel, Yankiv Yisrael ben Sora, Chaya Malka bas Shterna Sora, Scott ben Adam Ora bat Golda, Geffen ben Esther, and Yosef ben Shterna Sora. It's also a schus for the four Shlema, for Liebe Breine bas Alta Miriam, and Yosef Shlema ben Risha, Yehuda Leib ben Chan Heschel, Avigail bas Bela, Aretza be'ilam Shmo, Zahar Alya bas Mezotov, Shoshana Teva bas Leah, and Esther Malka bas Ahava. And it's a schus for the Kedoshim. Harav Faivel Eliezer ben Dobra Bela Hashem Yimkom Dami, Halevi ben Hashem Yimkom Dami, and Meisha Ada ben Yosef Hashem Yimkom Dami, and Reuven ben Emmanuel Hashem Yimkom Dami, and Yankov ben Tzvi Halevi Hashem Yimkom Dami, and Marika bas Sara Hashem Yimkom Damo, and Matilda Bri Britvan Hashem Yimkom Damo, Dan El Kayam Hashem Yimkom Dami, Alex Kleitman Hashem Yimkom Dami, Peter Mager Hashem Yimkom Dami, Boris Tettelroyd Hashem Yimkom Dami, and Tiber Weitzman Hashem Yimkom Dami, and HaKadosh Tzvi Hashem Yimkom Dami ben Alexander Kain Shlita, and Lenishmas Meish Yehuda ben Tzvi. The shir is also a schus for Chaya bas Rezel, Yisrael Shimon ben Edna, for Zara Chaya b'Kayama. Okay, Rabbi said we're doing Basi Ligani. And this is, forgive me, this is our fourth class on the Mamer from Tofshin Chavov. And to be sure, if you listen to the first three classes, two of them are posted, the third has not yet been edited. Friday's class, I did not have a chance to edit. I hope to do it tonight or tomorrow. We've been pushing the point of the Pedic towards the end of the Mamer. And the point of the Pedic is that there's something called Oitzer, a treasure. And the treasure is called Ein Seif L'mayla Adin Kates, godliness which is high beyond the purpose. And Ein Seif L'mayla Adin Kates is defined by the Rebbe as godliness which is not only hidden, but it's Ein Begeder Gil. There's no possibility for it ever to be revealed. And yet this treasure is given to us. And that's what the Mamer is about. The Mamer is saying that godliness, which is by its own definition absolutely inaccessible and in no way communicable, is somehow ours. And that is the struggle of the Mamer, how to explain how something which you cannot give has been given to us. So in the last class, which included pages Kuf Tzadik Gimel, Kuf Tzadik Dal, and Kuf Tzadik Hey, we had several ideas presented to slowly bring us to an understanding of how this is possible. The first was the concept of a Ratzon, that will overpowers the koiches. Will is the master of all of the koiches. It's not revealed in the body in any particular place. It supersedes, it overrules the koiches. But the way will interfaces with the faculties is that if you're using your mind based on your will, the energy, the life that is engaged in that use of the mind comes from the koyach, comes from the mind, not from the will. But the will directs it. And the same is true in every faculty, the mind, the heart, seeing, hearing, walking, using your hands and using your feet were the examples that the Rebbe brought. But the Rebbe specified that there's two levels of will. There's a lower will and a higher will. And he compares it to Nasa v'Nishma. What is the difference between the lower will and the higher will? The lower will, Hashem wills, and what Hashem wills, we will. He wants us to do a mitzvah, and because He wants us to do the mitzvah, we want to do the mitzvah as well, and therefore we do it. But then there's a higher will. And the higher will is called Nasa. And that higher will is that whatever Hashem wills, we do. Meaning it's not that because He wills it, we will it, but because He wills it, we do it. And the only part that's attributable to us is the action. Because His will has taken over us to the extent that we don't even need to will. Whatever He wills, this is what we do. This is the first point that the Rebbe brings to attempt to illustrate what it means that the treasure is given to us. The second point that was brought in the Mamer to help illustrate how this will reaches us is the idea of a bias, of a home. A home is a shared space. It's a demarked space. It's separated from the greater environment, but it's not specific to one person like clothing. It's not tailored to one person's size. It can actually hold multiple people. Many people can be in the same environment because the relationship between a home and a person is not specific to that person. It's all-encompassing, meaning to say its effect on the person is so far away from the person that although it affects the person is protected by the home and given definition by the home, and on some level the person gives the home a definition, but it's all done from a remote place, from a distance. And to explain this, the Rebbe compared this to mitzvahs versus Torah. Mitzvahs are called garments, levushim. Every mitzvah is a separate garment. And Torah is called makif harochik. And I explained it to you in the class that I gave on Friday morning, that all the mitzvahs are written in the Torah. But the way the mitzvahs are written in the Torah, they are as the Torah itself is, above time and above space. Which is why a person can learn about any mitzvah, about at any time and in any space, and get credit for having done that mitzvah. I can study about a korban anytime I wish, even if I'm not a kohen, even if I'm not a male, even if I'm not pure, even if I'm not in Eretz Yisrael, and you can do any mitzvah. On the level of Torah, there's no limitations of time and space. And therefore, all mitzvahs are included in any learning of Torah that I do. And that sort of qualifies the mashal of a bias. So those are three clues. We call them three clues. That these three clues, the mashal of will, specifically the will where Hashem's will does not affect our will. Hashem's will affects our action directly. And the mashal of a home, and the mashal of how we can be Yidden on the level of Torah, where we're above the limitations of time and space, and therefore all mitzvahs are included in any part of Torah that I learn. When I'm doing mitzvahs through limadat Torah, I'm doing it in such a remote space. These three clues are meant to help us understand how a level of godliness, which is called stima dechol stimen, it's so hidden away that not only is not revealed, it's not begeder gile, it can never be revealed, has somehow been given to us. Those are just clues, those are just pieces. And they're not the whole picture. And then the Rebbe gave us a fourth clue. And the fourth clue was that when one has ideas that are absolutely impossible to explain, they use the tool, the medium of allegory, of mashal. When you have to explain things which are absolutely impossible to explain, you use the medium of illustration, of mashal. Now, using an example to explain an idea is foreign to the idea, because you're using a mashal from something which is very low, very far away. But because of that, through the use of the mashal, you have access to ideas that you otherwise would not have any access to whatsoever. So this fourth idea we talked about on Friday, and when we talked about it on Friday, I discussed it a little bit. And what I said was that in Chassidus, when they want to use the example of a mashal, of an illustration to help explain things, they use different levels of mishalim, different levels of, or different tools for explaining things. The simplest is called derech ktsara. You want to explain something to students. Students are not that bright, so you say it in very few words, so the student should not get confused. The second is mashal, use an example. And the third is chida, is a riddle. And if I'm not mistaken, I saw in Chassidus that there's 2 levels for a riddle, but when I was preparing these classes, I went looking for those sources and I was not able to find them. But my recollection, there's actually 4 madregas, not 3 madregas, but 4 madregas. And the idea is that things which you can't explain thoroughly, you explain in short words. Things which you can't explain in short words, you explain using a mashal, an illusion, an example. And things that you cannot even explain using a mashal, you use the mashal of a chida, of a riddle. What you're doing is you're creating a very, very foreign body as a means to carry the idea that you cannot deliver directly. This 4th clue has to explain to us the first 3 clues and bring us closer to understanding what is the question of the Mamer. If there's a level of godness which is called Ein Seif L'mayla Adin Kates, which means not only is it not revealed, it's not begeder gil, it can never be revealed. Somehow it is given to us. The ungivable is given, the unrevealable is available. And these 4 clues that we had in the previous class, which are now going to be qualified by additional clues, in this class are going to help bring us closer to understanding how Hashem gives us the Elikus, which is called Ein Seif L'mayla Adin Kates, or Stima the Chol Stimen, which is, as our Mamer is teaching us, is the oiter, is the treasure, which the king gives to the generals, which is the Rabbeim. The Rebbe says the Pekidei Achala, the generals, which is the Rabbeim, on behalf of the Anshe Chel, the soldiers, which is us, in order to win the Milchemes Nitzachon, the war that you cannot afford to lose, to bring this Gals of Melech HaMashiach B'Peil Mamish. This is where we're holding. This is where we're holding. So I have 2 choices. Choice number 1 is to teach and then to explain. And choice number 2 is to explain and then teach. I am choosing the latter. I'm first going to lecture you. I'm first going to talk. What I'm saying now is going to explain the example of a riddle, of a mashal and a chida. And it'll also explain what's going to follow, which is the idea that in the stories of the Tanakh and the stories of the Torah, you have the greatest secrets of the Torah. I'm going to first discuss it with you, and then we're going to learn it, okay? But in order for me to discuss it with you, I have to bring into this conversation another idea. I just need you to understand that what I'm about to say is not in the Mamer. It's in Samach Vov at length, in the Maimorim of before Shavuos, Tafresh Samach Zayin. It's a series of Maimorim where the Rebbe Rashab talks about Torah, and specifically Torah Shabal Peh. But I believe it's the best way for me to present this inyan in a way that people are able to actually understand it. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm now going to have a conversation with you about Torah Shabal Peh, about the oral Torah Shabal Peh. The reason I'm having this conversation with you is because I'm hoping that will help you understand the significance and the meaning of the example of a riddle, and understanding the example of a riddle will enlighten the first 3 examples of a home and Torah and the Ratzon of Nasa. It'll put everything together. It'll make it all fit together into a scheme, into a unity, into an achdus. And this is the idea b'kitzur nimra. It's the idea very briefly. Okay. So now, Rabbi, let me give you this discussion of Torah. Okay. The Rebbe Rashab in the Samach Vov, in a brilliantly beautiful way, talks about the Tanoim. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir, and the whole period of Tkufa Bayisheni, the Zuges, and then the Beis Hillel and the Beis Shammai and their students, and so on. And what the Rebbe Rashab explains is the following: that in the times of the first Beis HaMikdash, there was a Ruach HaKodesh, there was a divine spirit. And this you have a lot in Torah Eitz, now the Rebbe also. This Ruach HaKodesh made it so that when a person opened up the Sefer Torah and he read it, the Sefer Torah almost came to you. Meaning, You read the words of Teresh B'Ksav. The words of Teresh B'Ksav are very few and very cryptic. But if you were sensitive to the godliness of those words, the words gave you their own interpretation. Which means that for people to study Torah at the time of the first Beis HaMikdash was like what we call proverbially Talmud Yerushalmi. It was easy. They read it, they understood it, and they did it. My father Zagazunzain told me that the Rebbe would said in the Fabringen that in the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, people opened up a Sefer Torah and they used it the way you and I use the Shulchan Aruch. They paskened halachas from Mikra. Now you open up a Chumash, you don't even know what mitzvah it's about, let alone how to do the mitzvah. The reason they could open up a Sefer Torah and know what to do is because, quote unquote, the lights were on. So the words are limited. The oisias are limited, but Torah shebeksav is Shmeisav Shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's the divine name of God. And if you could see in the Mikra, the Ruach HaKodesh, if you could see in the words, the divine inspiration, how to apply these ideas to practical mitzvahs comes to you easily, automatically. And of course, one of the strange details about the period of the first Beis HaMikdash was that in every generation people studied Torah and decided for themselves how to do mitzvahs. I mean, the basic design of mitzvahs, we have Allah L'Meisha Meisini, as the Rambam explained in the introduction to Pirush HaMishnayos. That Moshe Rabbeinu came down from the mountain and he told us what tefillin is, and he told us what a matzah is, he told us what a mezuzah, he told us what an esrog is. But when it came to the halachas, the specific details revolving around the kiyum mitzvahs, every rav and every dar paskin halachas. And a different generation, he gave you a different halach, psak. A different generation gave a third psak. It didn't matter. Because this was the truth of Torah. They had the mitzvahs, and if they had a shaila about a mitzvah, they went to a rav or they opened the Sefer Torah themselves, and the Ruach HaKodesh allowed them to see what the halacha was, and they did it. But then the Ruach HaKodesh subsided and it went away completely. Like it says in the Pasuk, Ve'echovda Choser Hei, that in Bayisheni was Choser Chamisha Devar, and second base was missing 5 artifacts. But what was missing most of all was the Ruach, divine inspiration went away. Prophecy dissipated, and the revealed presence of godliness, which was available to any person who studied Torah, was eliminated, and Yidden found themselves in darkness. And of course, historically, this created a terrible divide between the Tzdukim and the Baitusim, and the Kroim and the Prushim, where they wanted to continue the earlier tradition of a very spiritual Yiddishkeit based on the presumption of Ruach HaKodesh. And the Chazal, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, although many of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah themselves were Nevi'im, they were prophets, but they knew that Tkufas HaNevi'im was coming to an end. They therefore changed the center of gravity of Yiddishkeit away from Ruach HaKodesh towards Limud HaTorah Sheba'al Peh, the academic, intellectual interpretation of Torah. And at the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, by the Prushim, the most important house was not the Beis HaMikdash, the most important house was the Beis HaMedrash, was the yeshiva, where people studied Torah Sheba'al Peh. And the Tzdukim and the Baitusim and the Kroyim were screaming, we want to be like Zman Bayis Rishon. Even though the Ruach HaKodesh was subsiding, they wanted to hold on to it, and we all know exactly where they ended up. But they made a churban. Before they ended up where they ended up, they turned the world upside down. And at the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, a whole new idea emerged, which is the intellectual interpretation of Torah. You open up a Sefer Torah, and you study it with your seichel, no Ruach HaKodesh, cold intellect. In fact, Ruach HaKodesh would have been seen as an interference. You wanted to use your mind to study the Torah and be mechavan l'mitasa shel Torah. And you have to repeat again. We had the Shmuos. We had the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu told us what tefillin is, what mezuzah is, what a matzah is, and what a lulav is, and what a esrog. That's why there's no machlokes about Yidden what's an esrog. There's no machlokes about Yidden, Sfardim, Ashkenazim, Taimaner, Italiener. Everybody has the same hadassim and the same aravis, because Moshe Rabbeinu told us explicitly what they are. But the halachas of Torah Sheba'al Peh, of which there are an infinite number, Allah may say mispar, I think let me tell halachas, and the way that is extracted from the Torah became based on the intellectual study of Torah Sheba'al Peh. So people like Rabbi Akiva, like Rabbi Shmuel, like the disciples of Rabbi Akiva, the teachers of Rabbi Akiva, the teachers of the teachers of Rabbi Akiva, they became people whose pursuit of the truth of the Torah was predicated on a very, very, very intense intellectual study. But there was a key to this, a very, very important key to it. And the key was that they had to respect the words and the letters and the crowns of the letters of the Torah. They couldn't edit the Torah Shebeksav. Any person who thought he wanted to edit Torah Shebeksav was automatically not qualified to be a Tanner and a Mamer. They had to know, just like every scientist knows that there are facts that we try to analyze, the Tanoim's facts were the Eisius of Torah Shebeksav. And their whole exercise was to honor and to respect the words and the letters and the crowns of the letter of the Torah Shebeksav infinitely, and to search for the truth based on the fact that the way the Torah is written is exactly the way the Torah is supposed to be written. And if you want to find the truth of the Torah, you have to respect the Torah, and you have to ask questions of the Torah. You have to seek answers to those questions based on that constant that the letters of the Torah you don't budge. And they created what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition, all Torah. And of course, now there was a huge change introduced by the Anshkas Sagadela, which is what's called binding halacha. When an earlier Bezdin made a halacha, the next Bezdin didn't remake that halacha, like it was in the time of the first Beis HaMikdash. What was established in an earlier Sanhedrin was automatically carried over to the later Sanhedrin. And if a later court wanted to overrule a psak din of an earlier court, there had to be all kinds of criteria to be gadol b'chachma, but there were rules that needed to be implemented in order to change a halacha. But the process by which halachas were determined was literally by groping in the dark. They looked at the words of the Torah, they asked questions on the words of the Torah, they gave answers to those questions with an infinite respect and belief in the sanctity of those letters and those words, and on that basis they were mechaven lamitos shel Torah. They found the truth of the Torah. In other words, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael and Hillel and Shammai and Basil and Beis Shammai and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his Talmidim and the whole lot of Tanoim and Ameroim, beginning with the Zuges and continuing the big yeshivas and then the Tzaris and the Chorban and what came after the Chorban, all of that, all of these people created Torah Sheba'al Peh based on the use of their mind. And what makes their Torah true was their great intellectual prowess, they were very powerful brains, and literally an infinite respect and a belief in the sanctity of the letters and the words of the Torah. They didn't touch the words and the letters. They had to study, the words had to give them the ideas. The words had to give them the halachas. Like the famous example which is brought, that when a person is in a room and he has a candle or a match or a flashlight, he opens up the light and he can see exactly where he is, and he can see the ratios and the relationship and the distances, and he can walk out the door. But if a person is in the dark, he gropes and he touches and he taps, and he makes one mistake, he makes a second mistake and a third mistake till he finds the door and he leaves the room. But in tapping, in darkness, he sees detail that when the lights are on and you can go straight to the door, you don't notice because you don't need to notice them. Which is why it says in Chassidus that the Tanoim, who were in darkness, who were studying the Torah without the Ruach HaKodesh that pervaded the first Beis HaMikdash, and all they had was the tools of their mind and their faith and their respect and belief in the sanctity of the letters and the words and the crowns of the Torah, they reached understanding of the Torah even deeper than there was in the time of the first Beis HaMikdash when the lights were on. Azei Sheitan Chassidus. That in their darkness, they were mechaven lamitos shel Torah. They found the truth of the Torah by groping in the dark because of their dedication. To make a mistake is so easy. To discover that you made a mistake is almost impossible. To get it right 100% of the time, you have to be so loyal, so dedicated, so interested in the truth, and have so eliminate one's ego so completely that the only thing that matters is what the truth is going to say, based on how we study Torah Sheba'al Peh, And the Tanoim and Amoraim merited to create Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, which is binding on Jewish people till Mashiach comes, basically, because of that intellectual prowess, compounded by their respect for the words and the letters and the crowns of the Torah and the belief in the sanctity of these words and letters and crowns. So I need you to understand what that means. The Torah is a book that's intellectual. For a person who has Ruach HaKodesh, you read the book, you see the ideas, and you experience the light. For a person who's in the dark, the book is not intellectual. The book is sealed. The words have meanings, but the meanings don't mean anything. So you sit and you're studying the words, literally breaking down words into individual letters and parts of letters in order to, you're asking questions. Why is it written this way? Why isn't it written that way? Why is it written in this order? Why isn't it written in another order? All of the questions that they asked, and of course the Klali Halim were the rules by which they interpreted Torah Sheba'al Peh. And they were completely in the dark. God didn't tell them. They were looking for it on their own. They asked the questions on their own, and they gave the answers on their own. And Torah says that what they said was emes. So you must appreciate the profundity of this. If you're groping in the dark and you're looking for clarity about something, how do you know if you found the truth? Even if you're looking for that truth only for one idea. Now multiply that times the thousands and thousands of halachas that we have from the Zuges and the Tanoim and the Amoraim. And the thought that because of their intellectual strength and their holiness and their belief in the holiness of Torah, everything they gave us is true to the will of Hashem, is a remarkable thing. Because they knew it through darkness. They didn't know it through light, they knew it through darkness. They were reading words. They were broken down into letters and into crowns, tagim, crowns of letters. And they asked questions about why words are written this way and why words are spelled this way, and little tiny nuanced questions. And they came up with answers that would explain it, that would give us the halacha that we have. And their deductions were what the Eibishter wanted. But their deductions were true, notwithstanding that they were groping in the darkness. How do we know that the deductions were true? We know that the deductions were true is because they argued about them. How was Torah Sheba'al Peh fixed? Right? The rabbis were great arguers. Everything was a debate. When you presented a halacha and you brought a proof, somebody challenged it and you had to defend it. And they challenged and you defended and you defended and you defended until everybody agreed, or at least there was some kind of understanding that this was not refutable, it couldn't be defeated, and therefore it had a truth. Sometimes different rabbis had different interpretations of the psukim. Each was able to defend their position. Neither was able to dislodge the other, and both positions become part of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which we call Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. These and these are the words of the living God, and yet we say Shalish Shanim Nechelko b'Shamei Beis Hillel Yotza Baskal v'Omra Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim v'Halacha k'Beis Hillel. For 3 years, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai argued. These said it was allowed, this said it wasn't allowed, this said it was kosher, this said it was not kosher, this one said it's pure, this said it's not pure. Until a voice came out of heaven and said, these and these are both the words of the living God, but the halacha is like Beis Hillel. So appreciate this. People are reading the Torah, it's God's wisdom, but they don't understand it. They don't see the direct light of the Torah Sheba'al, what we call Oira Torah, Torah, the light of the Torah. They see darkness. In mystical terms, the letters of the Torah are shachros, the letters that are black, that are blacking the whiteness of the background of the Sefer Torah. But that darkness is the basis for questions that they asked, which becomes the key to the answers that they gave, that because of their infinite loyalty, resulted in them coming up with the interpretation which was actually what Hashem intended. This is the ultimate example of a riddle. God's wisdom is infinite. And God's wisdom is multi-layered. But the most important layer of God's wisdom is the layer of halacha l'maisa, the layer that teaches what we should do actionably. There are many other layers that give us philosophical definitions, and spiritual definitions, and mystical definitions, and logical definitions, but the interpretations that appeal to what we call kavanas ha-mitzvahs doesn't matter so much. How to do it matters most. They extracted from the black letters of the Teifet Teda, which were hiding the light from them, what Hashem wants us to do actionably, and what they figured out as the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even though all they had was letters and words. This is a great illustration, in my opinion, to what the Rebbe is trying to say here about a riddle. People want to explain things. If they're too difficult to explain, they try to say them in very concise words and lead you to understanding it. If they're even more difficult to explain, they give you an example, an allegory, a mashal, which helps you understand it. And if even that is difficult to explain, they give you a riddle. A riddle means they come up with a form that's completely removed from what it's a riddle for. It's very, very far away from what it's actually trying to teach you. And the idea is, it's like an intellectual leap. They give you this extremely far away form to present or represent the idea that they want to say, and either you get it or you don't get it. But if you're going to get it, you're not going to get it because it was given to you. You're going to get it because you're going to figure it out yourself through great effort, through great toil in the darkness. And when you decipher the riddle, when you uncover what the riddle represents, you know what the master of the riddle, what the source of the riddle, what the creator of the riddle intended. But you know it on a level of a riddle, meaning how it was originally, you don't have. All you have is the deduction, is the extrapolation, is the interpretation of the riddle on the level of the riddle itself. So most people who are going to get a riddle and not be told the answer, who are going to figure out the answer for themselves, are likely to come up with wrong answers. Somebody gives you a riddle and you solve the riddle. Is it true or false? The only way to know that is to ask the person who made the riddle. And if the person who made the riddle is unavailable because his name is God, for example, you don't know if you got to the truth or you created a new distortion. What is the criteria which is going to determine whether you came to the truth or the falsehood? How dedicated you are to looking for the truth. How much it matters to you. How earnestly you take it. How much of yourself you invest. And how much trepidation and fear you have in that pursuit because you're afraid of an error. And then if you merit, you come up with the correct clue, the correct answer to the riddle. But when you have the riddle, you don't have the original idea. You don't have what the Eibishter gave. You have a much, much, much lower version of it that's been delivered to you through an extremely indirect form, which is the riddle. And I am using Teresh Abal Peh as my riddle for this riddle. To understand the issue of our Mamer, which is that Hashem is giving us something which cannot be given. It's not only not revealable, it's not even the possibility of being revealed, and yet somehow we have it. So he gave us all of these clues about the Ratzon of Naseh and Bayis and Yiddishkeit on the level of Torah, and then he gave us the clue of a riddle, of a mashal v'chida, of an allegory and a riddle. And I added to these 4 clues what I just told you about Teresh Abal Peh. The rabbis who studied the Torah in the darkness figured out what Hashem means in this Torah, at least on the level of Allah, from darkness. How can you know for sure what Hashem wants if He doesn't tell you? And the words of His book that He gave you only confuse, they're confound, they're not clear and explicit. You come to it through question and answer, through debate, through argument. And of course the answer is, if you're singularly dedicated, if you have enough faith and enough respect and enough intellect and enough hard work, you can in theory find out what the Eibishter wishes for you to know. And the Tanoim successfully did so. So in this Mamer, the Rebbe is saying the same thing. There's a treasure that can't be given directly or indirectly, and yet we have it. How do we have it? We have it through the medium of a mashal v'chida, a riddle, an analogy, an analog. So we have the treasure, but we don't have the treasure in its original state. We don't have the treasure in its enlightened state. We don't have the treasure in its oir state. We have the treasure as it's been, what's the right word, redacted, adapted through an extremely separated medium, the medium of a riddle. So the original idea has reached us, but the original idea is not at all as it was in the original. Because the original idea as it was in the original is Eini Beged Gili. It's not givable. It's not revealable. But through this extremely separated mechanism of Mashal V'chida, we can have it as well. Like as per the idea that the Chazal came to the emes of Teira Shebapeh when groping in the darkness. In my humble opinion, this is the best way to explain what our Mamer is saying. Okay? And we're now going to read the text of the Mamer. But I'm going to repeat this one more time. Okay? The Mamer is describing a level of godliness which we cannot know and will never be known because it's not revealable. And the Mamer is saying that somehow it reaches us. And it reaches us indirectly through a garment which is so far away from the original that we have to dig so deep and work in darkness that's so dense in order to find any truth. But if we work hard enough, we find some truth. And the little bit of truth we find is very far away from the original version of what Stima Dechol Stiman is, but what we have is true to that idea. So something which we cannot have, we have because it's given to us through a huge quantum leap, through a huge separation, as represented by the mashal of a riddle. Now you can apply that idea to all the three examples we had before, that the will of Hashem becomes ours in a way where we don't even have our own will. His will simply affects our action directly, and we attribute to ourselves the action, the naseh, and not the rotz, not the will, because our will becomes His. The Eibishter figures out how to give us His will, which is so high, notwithstanding that it's not revealable in the kind of way that His will is ours. And the same is true with the mashal of bias and the mashal of Teira being bias, as we discussed before. We will now proceed with tonight's class. The class is 45 minutes old, in case if you don't know it yet. So in other words, I already gave a whole shiur before the shiur. What we're going to be learning inside is further development of this idea of a riddle. And I want to repeat again that if I remember correctly, and I didn't see it, I looked for it, there's going to be 4 levels. There's that aktsara, there's mashal, there's chida, and then there's even a deeper thing. There's emes v'chida. There's 4 levels. And the lowest level, in other words, ideas that are the highest, which cannot be communicated at all, are delivered to us through an extremely thick medium of darkness, through a riddle which is completely foreign to the original idea. And if we successfully resolve the riddle, if we successfully solve the riddle, we have a correct version of the original idea that's been so altered, that's been so changed, because it's come to us through the darkness of the riddle that we're able to have it, even though the original is called Stima Dechol Stiman. And that's the issue of this Mamer. Hashem gives us treasure which we're not able to get through a riddle. So we get a riddled version of it. It's far away from the original, but it's true. Just like halachas are far away from the Teira Eid, which is what Teira would be in Zman Bayis Rishon, and yet it's Amitasa Shel Teira, it's the truth of the Teira, at least on the level of halacha, which is the level of action, which is the lowest level of Teira, but the most important. And this is how the Rebbe is explaining to us how what we cannot have, we have in fact. So I'm going to read, but I'm going to let you speak first. Comments or questions?
A question. I do remember that Chido, it's in Samachol and other places, is represented by a remez that's not mislavish in Asians. So therefore, you talk about a person who makes a wave of the hand. If I remember the example, or the uplifting of the eyebrow to explain the subtlety So it's not so much that it's hidden, that it's subtle, and the subtlety can't be transferred in ACS, so that has to be expressed in that format, which isn't what you're saying, as I understand it.
No, it is exactly what I'm saying. Because you have to interpret the riddle. You have to interpret it. You get that little indicator, and you have to say, what does it mean? You have so little information, and you have to figure out the intent of that hint, as remote as it is. How do you do it? You use your intelligence, and you use your belief in the integrity of that hint. You know for sure that that hint is a divine hint, and it's worth it for me to dedicate my whole life to decipher it, to uncover it. And then you discover what the hint alludes to, and you say, this is the halacha, this is the practical way we're going to do a mitzvah based on this hint. So you got the truth on an actionable level, which is communicated to you not through an overt idea of Torah Shebiksav, an overt in of Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh, but to an extremely covert, extremely concealed garment of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And what Chassidus is saying, this is how they communicate the highest idea, through the thickest garment. And you get it through the groping in the deepest darkness, and having the greatest faith in the holiness of this, and the greatest dedication to looking for its truth. And when you find it, you have the highest truth. And in our Mamer, it's the Eitzer. In the Samach Vav, it's the Halachas of Torah Sheba'al Peh. I'm using that as a mashal for this idea. You follow?
All right, I understand what you're saying.
I'm using, but that's Pshat in Samach Vav. That's the Pshat in Samach Vav. That the godless of the Tanoim was their Mesiras Nefesh. That's the only way they were able to know emes from these very, very, very subtle hints. Because there was so little given to them, that there was so much possibility for them to make a misinterpretation. And the only reason they didn't misinterpret was because they had great minds, and because they had great faith and great Mesiras Nefesh. And they were zeichet to find the truth through that incredible effort. And in this Mamer, this riddle is a key to bringing to us the Yetzer Elyon. And it's going to reach us in a very, very different form than it was in the original, because the original is Ein Beged Gilui, but we're going to have it. And we're going to have it in truth. Just like the Tanoim and Amiroim gave us halachas of Torah Sheba'al Peh through a very thick haze, and it's the truth. So let's now continue reading the Rebbe's Mamer on page Kuf Tzaddik Hey, where he is explaining the previous Rebbe's Mamer. But the Rebbe sort of shifts away from seeing the previous Rebbe's Mamer as saying how it's impossible to have the Eitzer, to explaining how we get the Eitzer. He uses the previous Rebbe's own words, which the previous Rebbe is using to explain how far away from us it is. The Rebbe uses the same words of the Frierdiker Rebbe to say that even though it's so far away from us, it reaches us. And he continues and he says, Shazehu Gamkein, I am 6 lines into page Kuf Tzaddik Hey, please. Shazehu Gamkein Inyan Sipuriyat Torah. This notion of a riddle, of an allegory, of a mashal, which is very, very far away from the original idea, that is able to bring that truth to a very, very, very low level. But in order for that lower level to get it with truth, they have to have incredible dedication and loyalty to the truth of that idea, and to the sanctity of that idea, and to respect it, so that they can search for it and find it as it is in truth. This explains the stories of the Torah. I gave you the mashal of the halachas. The Rebbe gives the example of stories, because stories hide the wisdom of Hashem even more than the halachas do. And to read the stories of the Chumash as a medium to know the secrets of the Torah is finding an extremely foreign means for something extremely lofty. But if you respect the idea that these stories are holy and true and divine, and you search with sufficient dedication, you will see the secrets in these stories, And you will find that the greatest secrets of the Torah are not in the halachas of the Torah, but in these stories. The stories of the Torah on the outside are only stories. However, they have secrets. More than you have in the dinim of the Torah. Because halachas of Torah cannot carry the secrets of Torah. Because since halacha is a lower level, we can understand it more directly when we read the Torah. And since we can understand it more directly when we read the Torah, it cannot be a medium for things that are secret. When a person tells a story, and the story by itself doesn't sound like it has much substance, it becomes a garment which is sufficiently concealing to carry and represent an idea which is so lofty that it represents the deepest secrets of the Torah. There's a word from the Rabbi that I heard, that the Avram Sefer, who was the grandson of the Chassam Sefer, had a relationship with the Rabbi. And he told the Rabbi that he heard in the name of the Chassam Sefer that in the sugyas of Migi and Chazaka you have Seidei Seidus HaTorah. In the most profound halachas of Nigla you have the secrets of the Torah. So the Rebbe lowered his head and he raised his head and said, Seidus HaTorah, yeah. In Migi and Chazaka, in the Lamdas of Nigla the Torah, Teresh Balpeh, you have Seidus. Seidus HaTorah, the secrets, other secrets. Darf man trachten. I want to think about it. The deepest secrets of the Torah are hidden in the stories, because the stories seem to say nothing. And because they seem to say nothing, they reveal for the deepest. They're like riddles. While the halachas of the Torah, the psukim, that tells the dinim of kiyigach sheir ish sheir eyu v'meis, u'mochu es sheir achai v'chotzu es kaspe, v'gam es hameis yechatzon. There is enough logic here. In other words, the Torah Shabbat, as it relates to the halachas, is close enough to reason for it not to be able to carry the deepest secrets that can only come through the thickest veil. The thick veil is the stories, because the stories seem to say nothing, and therefore they're mediums to carry the deepest secrets of the Torah. It's because of these stories that the Torah as a whole is called an allegory, even though the halachas of the Torah, the psukim that tells the dinim, don't seem to be telling a story and don't seem to be a mashal, but the stories of the Torah are mishum shu seichel kazeh. It's such an idea shemitzad atzmei by itself, who sosum, it's concealed. It cannot reach us at all, except if it comes to us as a closed book. God gives us His wisdom, and we receive His wisdom in the words of the Torah, and it's as closed after we read it as before we read it. Just like before we read it, we knew nothing of the secret. After we read it, we know exactly as much, because the story is hiding the wisdom behind it absolutely. It's a sealed idea. Hashem gave us the Torah. We read the stories, the beautiful stories. I remember learning those stories when I was in the 2nd grade, in the 3rd grade, and in the 4th grade. The beautiful stories. But the stories don't say at all what's behind the stories. The Meister with the Mittel Rebbe Weisman, that after Alter Rebbe passed away, somebody read the Megillah other than the Alter Rebbe. Alter Rebbe used to read the Megillah himself. He used to read the Sefer Torah himself. When somebody else read the Torah, the Mittel Rebbe went over to him and gave him such a thank you. He said, I never heard such a beautiful story in my life. So he said to the Rebbe, you never heard the story? Every year. He said, nah, the Megillah I heard last year was a different story. It wasn't this story. The story you told, I never heard. Because when the Tata learned, when the Alter Rebbe read the Megillah, the Mittel Rebbe heard what's behind the veil of these stories. And when Shpleni Almaini, it was a nice story. There's a similar story from the Pelish Rebbes, which I can't remember at the moment, but it's a similar idea, where you read the story of the Megillah and it's a Maaseh, and you read the story of the Megillah and it's carrying it with it the deeper secrets of the Torah that are delivered b'derech stimos, meaning it's given to us and we have it, or to say it in Yeshivish, it's revealed to us and we have it, and it's not revealed at all. What's revealed is completely concealed, like as if we never heard it. But if we're able to unravel the analogy, the allegory, and again appreciate that there's a number of levels, and more difficult than a mashal is a chida, and more difficult than a chida is a rebbe, as you pointed out. Like I said, there's 4 madregas in the Samach Vav. You referenced it before, but I was not able to find it, about how Teresh Rapeh is delivered. And the more thick the garment of Torah that delivers the ideas of Torah to us is, the deeper the secret which is hidden behind it. And if you're able to study the mashal, you take the whole idea. It's an extremely lofty idea. And the only way for that lofty idea to reach us is b'derech stimos. Hashem gives it to us and we receive it. And in no way did we get it. And now we have to grope in the darkness of analyzing the mashal and the chida to get something from it. And if we have the proper dedication and the proper faith, we get something correct from it. And if and when we get something correct from those stories, what we just got, that's the treasure. That's the Eid and Sefer L'mayla Adin Kates, which is the treasure. Which explains the greatness of Shlomo HaMelech had to give 3,000 allegories for another person to understand the wisdom of Shlomo HaMelech. When the ideas are so high, it's not sufficient. One example. 2 or 3 examples. You have to have multiple examples until 3,000. The wisdom of Shlomo Melech, which is Seichel, which is the highest and loftiest ideas of Seichel. So he needs 3,000 allegories in order to bring an idea that he had to a level which we could have. And when we're going to get it, it's going to be by us afamachtet inyan, sealed away in an allegory and a mashal on top of a mashal on top of a mashal times 3,000. And if we were to decipher it, we'd be groping in the greatest darkness. And the only way this groping would be effective is if we had incredible dedication and incredible faith in the integrity and the sanctity of it all. And when we would find what there is to find, we would have the treasure. Later than Chazal, the Gemara says, Gimel Meis Mishals, you have to have 300 examples. And then there's 30 examples. And Anu Ein Lanu El Shalosh, we have only 3. I think the Gemara brings a Meir has 3 Mishal. So there's different levels. So of course, Bepashtus, when it says in the Poth V'da B'Shleish is a love of mashal, that Shlomo Melech spoke 3,000 analogies, I mean, he gave allegory for 3,000 ideas. Different ideas. Chassidus argues that in every idea of Shlomo Melech there were 3,000 layers of allegory to bring it closer and closer to us. One thought, he explained it with an analogy, and then an analogy to the analogy, and an analogy to the analogy to the analogy until 3,000, until we got something. But when something goes through so many screens, what we get is sussum, it's sealed. And if we toil and we uncover the truth, we have the equivalent of the treasure as it's leaped extremely because of the concealment which is between us and how the idea is in the original. So the downside is we're not getting it in the original. The upside is that we're getting it. But the only way to get it is indirectly. And that's how we have the Yitzhak. And the Rebbe is now going to bring a Torah de Baal Shem Tov and the Torah of the Mezritch Magid that are both going to support this concept. Beautiful stuff. First of all, let's bring the example of the Baal Shem Tov. Huva B'Kesser Shem Tov. That the Baal Shem Tov talks about Benegel, Isipurim, Shebet Torah. Baal Shem Tov studies the stories in the Torah. That of course the stories in the Torah are really hard to understand. We believe that Apayim Shana Kodma Torah Le'elam, that the Torah precedes the world. And if the Torah precedes the world, how could the Torah have stories that happen to real people in real time in this world? And a lot of the Mefarshim, including the Ramban, give explanations for how this is possible. But even if we accept that the stories that happen to real people in real time are part of the wisdom of Hashem which precedes the world, but how do we study these stories? And how do we find the secrets behind these stories? So the Baal Shem Tov gave an example. And there's 2 parts to this paragraph, by the way. There's 2 parts. The first part is what the king is doing, and the second part is why the king is doing it. It's very important that you appreciate there's going to be two parts to this Perek Zayin. Number one, the king hides himself from his son. And the only way to find his son is through a very, very secondary garment. And number two, why is he going through this exercise? Because there's a greater pleasure that comes from finding your son in a remote place. And that's the key. So the Baal Shem Tov gives a mashal, a melech. For example, a king shalach b'nei echid lemerchakim. He sent his only child far away. Why did he do it? The king wants to have pleasure from his son. He loves his son. The son is bright, the son is talented, the son is intelligent, the son is bold, a lot of milas. And the king enjoys his son. He sends his son out into the world to make his son's life more difficult. And he sends his son out into the world to make his life more difficult, because when the son is going to figure it out, the king will have a greater pleasure than the king would have if his life had been easier. And this is why he sends him off to such a faraway place where things are so hard, because he wants the reward of the pleasure that's going to come from a prince who's surviving that difficult situation. And what happens? Time passes, the prince forgets all the pleasures of the king. He forgets his mission. He forgets his roots. He forgets who he is and why he's there. And he loses interest. The king sends all kinds of emissaries to bring him back. He refuses to return to his father because he says, I'm not your son. Because he's lost to the father. No matter what the king sends, it's ineffectual. They had no common language. The people of the palace speak a very sophisticated language. This prince who's been estranged speaks a very, very crude language, and they don't understand each other. When does it help? There was one officer who had seichel. What did he do? He lowered himself to the level of the prince where the prince was then. Sheksus v'loshin shina kidmus haben hahu. That his clothing and the language he changed to be like the clothing and the language of the son where he is then. So he began to speak to the prince on the prince's level. And he became closer to this prince in his lowly state. Parenthesis. Beloshin shala ben melech, and the language of the prince, not the way it was in the palace. Is far away. And the prince now relates to him because he's speaking his language on a crude level. And ultimately, if he brings him back to his father. He comes down to the level of the prince's lowliness and crudeness. So the prince relates to him. And when the prince relates to him, he's able to bring him back to the palace. So the Rebbe says the Baal Shem Tov, this is the significance of Teda being in stories. That the stories are carrying the king in a form and in a garment that has an appeal to people who have no connection to what king is at all. The stories talk to us. They're moving to us. They're beautiful stories. Avraham, Yitzchak, Yankov, Yosef, his brothers. It's a very beautiful set of stories that give us all kinds of lessons. But what the stories are truly representing is so beyond us, we don't even know that we don't even know it. But at least we get something from it. And he says, Vehine, that's how Baal Shem Tov move. And what this teaching and this illustration teaches us, the king gets pleasure from his prince. If the king would not have sent his prince off, kept him in the palace, surrounded by an environment that was positive and supportive and conducive to royalty, the king would also have pleasure from his prince. But the pleasure he would have from his prince would not be nearly as deep, because the prince's life would be lived in a level which is closer to what the palace is. But the king wants more pleasure. If he wants more pleasure, he has to challenge the prince to dig deeper and to express the fact that he is royalty in a way that comes across very remote. And for this he sends him off. In order for the king to experience the greater pleasure from his son, the prince, is dafka the inyan as they put him. There's the stories, and the significance of the stories is the king putting on the garments of the peasantry and reaching the prince on the level of the peasants, and then the prince discovers that it's the king. So when the prince discovers that it's the king and he comes back to the palace, the prince discovered that it's the king through those garments. By discovering that it's the king through those garments, the king has an increase in pleasure, because those garments are a very, very poor representation of what the king is. They're a representation of the simple people. Somehow the prince sees through it to the king. Finding the king in such a thick garment gives the king a greater pleasure than finding the king when you're proximate to the king. And that's the stories of the Torah. The stories of the Torah, which is the king coming down. The king putting on the garments and the language of the prince. Is he able to bring him back? If the prince will never return, the king would never send him there. Because the only reason he's being sent far away is rak bishvil sheyachzir, he should come back. The king sends him over with the understanding that he's going to come back. And when the prince gets lost, doesn't want to come back, you reach him by putting on his clothing and speaking in his language to bring him back. And this is affected. You change your language, change your tongue, change your garments, change your language. Which is godliness is delivered to worldliness on the medium of stories. These stories are, as the Chazal say, ein mikra yetze midei pshuta. No stories, not literally stories, actually occurred. But they carry incredible depth of the infinite wisdom of God in a language that's foreign to the divine. But that's how it gets to us. The call said, this is Kanal said before Shemelech Reitzalei Tainuk Sam, the king who has pleasure from his son already wants more Tainuk. He wants said Tainuk greater pleasure. Shebetainu guf in pleasure itself, and Nikola Daga Shebei, all the levels in it, Eine Yeser. Is not more, Shada Yeshna Madrega Shalom Mailam, and it's always a level above it. You have to get a pleasure above all other pleasures. And the pleasure above all other pleasures the king gets from his prince who was estranged and came back. That's a simple pleasure, which is, as we're going to discuss later, the highest madrega of Tainu. So the king loves his son. He challenges his son. And he goes to find his son in the place of that challenge. And he communicates to his son through an extremely remote garment. And the son hears and reacts. The son hears through all these thick veils that the king is behind it, and he comes back to the palace. And when the king sees that his son was effectively reached, in spite of the fact that he's so far away, came back because of these stories, the king gets the ultimate pleasure. Tainuk b'yesir. So this Torah Baal Shem Tov about the Chumash being Hashem putting on the garments of a foreigner in order to reach those who are far away, illustrates the mechanism of Chida, that through this there's much darkness, but in that darkness the truth is present, and it's uncovered through the veil, through the levush, but at least we have the truth, notwithstanding that it's through the levush. So that's the Baal Shem Tov. Once we can the Baal Shem Tov, now we go to the Teres HaMagid. It also explains the Mizrich HaMagid's Torah, which is much more mystical. The Baal Shem Tov's Torah is gorgeous. It's a really wonderful pshat. The Torah Shebeksav is Hashem putting on our clothing to talk to us, even though He's revealing us things which are way beyond us. And the Magid brings the pasuk Derech Shleishes Yom Nelcha Bamidbar, that the Yidden say to Pare, we will go in the road for 3 days. This is in Pashas Va'era, before they leave. The purpose for this journey 3 days is to get the Torah. And in order to leave Mitzrayim and get the Torah, we have to journey 3 days. As Zezog the Mizrich HaMagid. And the Magid explains the Kishanit na Torah Bisina, when the Eibusha gave us the Torah Nitna, Bedibur was given through speech. You can't have speech without thought before it. What we speak comes from what we thought. Turn to page Kuf Tzadik Vav. And that's the meaning of what Shleishis Yomim Nelech Bamid. We're going to go in the midst for 3 days. By the Eibishter giving, by Pada giving us 3 days, the message of the Eibishter reaches even us, Gam Basiya into even in Asiya, Shazal Ba'elam Asiya, which is the world of action. So the Pasuk says we're going to travel 3 days in the desert, and the Rebbe explains that godliness is going to reach the lowest madregas. Umaz ben Nimzich Magid explains, Shateiru mitzvahs nimtzayim b'chol elam ve'elam v'yan. Teiru mitzvahs exist in every world. Chomash em the matzav na'le yeser. When you're in a higher world, reim as a teiru mitzvahs b'leitim zimukach. You see the teiru with less concealment, and on a lower level you see the teiru with greater concealment. Okay, and share with you an idea. In Tanakh, there's 3 merkavas. In Tanakh, there are 3 chariots. The highest level is the Merkava of Yeshaya, which is El Mabriya, the chariot of Isaiah. The second level, the chariot of Yecheskel, Ezekiel, which is the Madrega of Yetzirah. And the third chariot is the chariot of Zechariah, of Zechariah, which is the chariot of Asiya. So it says in Chassidus, a fascinating thing. The Merkava of Yeshaya is the Haftarah of Pashas Yisrei. The Merkava of Yecheskel is the Haftarah of Shavuos. What's strange? The Kabbalah is the Haftarah of Yecheskel, not the Haftarah of Yeshaya. The Haftarah of Yeshaya is a few words, very few. It's considered a much higher level of godliness, a much higher chariot. But there's almost nothing written there. Ezekiel is a big arichas, there are all kinds of details, 31 psukim of details. And Chassidus says, how come Yeshaya, which is a higher level, reveals so little? And how come Yecheskel, which is a lower level, reveals so much more? And there's a very simple answer. If you walk into a palace and you're meeting a king, and you appreciate and understand who that king is, you simply do not notice the furniture. You don't see anything but the king. But if you visit a palace and you're not smart enough to appreciate who the king is, all you see is the furniture. Because the decorative furniture decorates the king. The king becomes significant and important and substantial because of the furniture he has. So the biggest tzaddikim, the highest madrigas, walk into the Eibishter's world. They see the Eibishter, they don't notice the furniture. Smaller tzaddikim walked into the Eibishter's world and not so sensitive to lakus, they have to notice the furniture. Because only, like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya chapter 42 in the Haggadah, you go into a Chatzar HaMalchus, to a kingly courtyard, and you see harbe anoshim mishtachavim leish echad, many people bowing down to one person, even though you don't know who that person is and how that person is great, you know he must be a great person. Similarly, when you see the furniture, it helps you appreciate the king, because the king by himself you don't understand. So it says in Chassidus that the most descriptive Merkava is Zechariah, because it's the lowest. The least descriptive Merkava is Yeshaya, because it's the highest. Because in a higher world there's more godliness, you don't need to notice the furniture because you're seeing the king himself. In the lower world there's less godliness, you don't appreciate the king without the furniture. And that's the similar idea of mashal that we had earlier. Now let's read the Mamer inside. And he explains that mitzvahs exist in every world. If you're in a higher level, you see mitzvahs with less contractions. And he gives it the example of Yecheskel and Yeshaya and Zechariah. And it says in the Gemara, Yeshaya came and didn't explain. Yecheskel came and didn't explain either. They did, none of them described a front and a back, meaning Yeshaya and Yecheskel were above describing the Torah in so much detail, even though relative to one another, Yecheskel describes more. And then Zechariah upirsha, like it says in the Pasuk, Megillah off upon a bach. The idea that the Torah should be the front and the back is explained by Zechariah, because he's in the lowest level. On the lowest level, he's the maximal explaining. Keteirum is B'Shem Ben Elam not Liesa Teirum, which is in a higher world and believe things are less concealed. Urachov and believe in Dinas Vagbos and the bird without any measures and any limits. And therefore they reveal godliness in a higher level and don't require tzimtzum. Mash ein ken k'meshe yerdim elam tachten yesa, they come into a lower world. Befrat le'elam hazeh tachten, this is the lowest of all the worlds. Tachten shein tachten lamat amen. And the oz yesh b'chol mitzvah midah v'shir, everything is very limited. In the higher world it's less limited, and in this world it's more limited. But the limitation of this world is a garment, is a mushal, is a chida for the deeper secrets of the Torah. The lesser limitations of the higher world is a garment for a lower level of godliness. It's all inverse. The thicker garment in the lower world is carrying a godliness from a higher source. Gamkin also explains, explains that since in this world, Teiro mitzvahs is so far from the Eibush that it comes down b'medida v'agbala, but in this medida v'agbala you have the highest levels of Elokus. And accordingly, the Eibush displeasure. It's explaining also what the Message Magi says. The pleasure Hashem gets is also limited. But coming to a higher world, to a lower world, it's not so limited. The pleasure is more. And when it's more limited, the pleasure is less. But then it's walking 3 days in the desert means coming down through 3 levels. That becomes attached to thought and speech, which is Bria and Yitzir. And in order to unify the level of Asiyah, which is this world, with the level of thought and speech, which is Bria and Yitzir, respectively, it's idea Tainuk. The Eibish's pleasure in bringing godliness to the lowest worlds joins together the lower worlds and the higher worlds. As we see, in fact, people have pleasure to bring together two different people. 2 different things come together through pleasure. That although on the surface they're not connected, they may be diametrically opposed to one another. But when you use tainug, when you use pleasure, you can bring together these opposites. It's the end of the Teres HaMagid. What is the meaning of Derech Sheishes Yamim? The Torah comes on through 3 worlds. And the lowest world is the farthest away. The lowest world is the greatest symptom. And the Rebbe is about to explain that somehow in the lowest world you also have the greatest tainuk. And the question is that the pleasure of Hashem is more in his speech than in his action. The pleasure is more in his thought than in his speech. Why is it important to have the level of action? Isn't it enough to have the spiritual levels? Why have to have action? That's the question. Why to have action? What? In other words, it's enough thought. And he continues and he says, this thought was before speech. I'm sorry, Keda Matan Teda. Before the Eibush gave us a Teda, there was a level of thought. That explained at length in the Teres HaMagid. So much that they call you there's a great symptom from world to world, from level to level. Which makes the pleasure limited until you come to the lowest world. And the question becomes, why you have to have 3 days? To actualize the given Teda in Asiyah, but Tzimtzum Yesa, the pleasure of Asiyah is the lowest. If the higher worlds have more godliness and more tainug, and the lower worlds have less godliness and less tainug, what's the point of bringing the Teda to the lowest world? What's the point of what the Mesilas Maggid calls the walking 3 days? And the answer is, it's actually, this idea itself is explaining the point. Commission is by a little bit Teres HaBashem to explain Teres HaBashem to be an emotion, the example of an example that the stories of the Torah are a very, very thick veil, but they're carrying the deepest secrets. When you stop, the stories of the Torah seem to be simple, but they're carrying the deepest secrets dafke, because they're such a foreign medium that therefore can carry the highest secrets. In that remote situation of the greatest pleasure. Says the Rebbe, the same is true here. Although on the surface, the pleasure of thought is greater than the pleasure of speech, and the lever of speech is greater than the pleasure of action, which means the pleasure from the world of thought, which is Bria, gives the Eibishter more pleasure than the pleasure of the world of speech, which is Yetzirah, and more pleasure than the pleasure of the world of action, which is Asiyah. But there's another perspective. And for the other perspective, it's exactly the other way around. If you want to bring together opposites, tzarech is tainuk shlei bechet, have a higher pleasure. And in context, it's the idea that a very foreign mushal is carrying the deeper secrets of the Torah. In the nimshal, pleasure brings the highest ideas of Torah to the lowest people. The same is true here in the Torah Hamagid. In order to bring together opposites, tzarech li is tainuk shalei be'echad, have a higher pleasure. V'tainuk gadol zeh, and this highest of pleasures, after the kabel dafka desi, is only available through an action, not through speech and not through thought. Ki b'chol inyan ezesh yesh elamala mi'asiyah, any idea above action, like speech, like thought, like feeling, like ideas. Midas hatainuk tolui b'midas hadovesh mamshechas hatainuk. The measure of pleasure depends on the nature of the thing which is conducting the pleasure, whether it's machshava lefi inyana and dibur lefi inyana and so on. So therefore, the tainuk is medida v'shir. The pleasure is going to be limited. K'vi medida v'ashir shebetainuk. The pleasure is going to be limited by the level that's carrying it, and what's carrying it is limited by the pleasure. Masha'inkin, Basi, when it comes to action, where the physical mitzvahs are only a mashal of something which is very divine, nimshach tainuk kamesha hu l'maylim ekol madregas. The pleasure which is brought to us is the highest of all, and the Rebbe says in Yiddish, the ganzer etzem inyan atayin, the whole essence of the tainuk. Meaning, in the Hava Amina, we saw the higher worlds having higher tainuk, and the lower worlds having lower tainuk, and wondering why it had the lower worlds. And in the Maskana, the lowest worlds have a tainuk which the higher worlds can never have. Because the lowest worlds have the tainuk that comes from the godliness which is concealed in Asiyah. And only Asiyah represents concealment to such an extent that it's like the riddle. That because it's so far away, it's carrying a godliness which is the highest madrei. And that's the Torah Samagid. The Baal Shem Tov explained to us the stories of the Torah based on a person who speaks the language of the stories. And the Midrash Magid speaks about 3 days, 3 worlds, Bria, Tzir, and Asiyah. How in each world there's pleasure. In the lowest world, Bepashas, there's the lowest pleasure. But when the lowest world uncovers what's hidden behind the godness of the lower world, it reveals the highest pleasure, which can only be revealed down here. So the Torah Baal Shem Tov of explaining the Sipuri Ma'aseh Shabbatera, and the Torah Rabbi Magid of explaining how the pleasure of Asiyah reaches higher than the pleasure of all the higher pleasures, we're meant to understand how this treasure, which can never be revealed because it's not by Yad Gili, we already have. So if you want to tie in this shiur with the previous shiur, in the previous shiur we talked about Hashem's will influencing our will to do an action versus Hashem's will taking over our will. All we do is the action, the will is His. For Hashem's will to be ours, where we don't have a will of our own, we have to have a submission to Him, where His will doesn't touch our will, it bypasses our will because it comes from a higher level and reaches our action. Or the example of a home and the Torah, and how Torah is Yechida, Torah is the Madrega of Bais, Makav Arochi. What's the concept? In all of those things, that when the Torah comes to us through a more foreign medium, it's a proof that what's hidden behind it is from a higher space, and from that higher space we're capable of nasa. We're capable that His will should supplant our will, and we should do it just because of His will. And I guess that higher place, which reaches us through the lower medium, is how we have the Yossi, how we have the treasure. But the shiur is not finished. In other words, let's say I make a new shiur out of Perek Yud. We have Perek Tes. And Perek Tes is the most sublime part of this whole thing. Perek Tes is really, it's sublime. That's the right word. It's sublime. And I'll tell you what's going to be said in Perek Tes, okay? What's going to be said in Perek Tes is the following. People do things, all kinds of things. And when people do things, there is often a reward that comes along with doing it. For example, you're an artist, and you're drawing, You're a musician, and you're composing music or you're playing music. So you're involved in something. And you're involved in something very specific. You're involved in something very specific. This piece of music, this piece of art. But the nature of things is that when you engage in art, you're flooded with art ideas, art feelings. I'm making one picture. But as I make that picture, the language of the Mamer is going to say, there is the light of art in general that illuminates my effort. The reward for engaging in art is not just that I'm making this picture, but as I make this picture, I'm experiencing the world of art, the light of art as a noun in a very rich way. And the same is true of music. When I'm writing music or playing music, music is filling me. And the idea that music is filling me is not just the piece of music I'm writing or the piece of music I'm playing. Music is enveloping me as a totality, as a wholeness. And the Rabbi says the same is true with ideas. If you study and you engage your mind in learning something, you're learning one idea and you're completely engaged and you're trying to understand it. There's a fact that as I engage in that idea, my mind is flooded with the light of the world of ideas in a rich way. It's like a reward. When you're fully involved in something, besides what you're doing, you have something much, much more that's sort of around what you're doing, which is the reward for what you're doing. When you study ideas, you're rewarded with a sense of the richness of ideas as a whole. When you do art, you're surrounded with the richness of the idea of art as a whole. And the same is true in everything. The Maimon makes it as an assertion. Whatever you do gives you a light. The light that it gives you is outside of what you're doing immediately, but it's the consequence of what you're doing. So if you're learning ideas, as you learn those ideas, your mind is flooded with a light, which is not that particular idea, but it's other ideas, or the idea of ideas that surround that idea. Now listen carefully to the chap. Listen carefully to the chap. If I learn an idea, in addition to the idea that I'm learning, I have the light of ideas, yeah? If I'm learning a higher idea, I'm going to experience a light which surrounds ideas, which is going to be even higher. If I learn an idea which is even higher than that, I'm going to experience a light which is even higher than that. So the Rebbe says something very profound. A person can learn ideas that are not just high, but they're deep. And because they're deep, the reward for those ideas is a light. But the light is hidden. Meaning, when I'm studying lower ideas, the secondary light that I experience along with that idea enlightens my ideas. When I study extremely deep ideas, the secondary light, which is a reward for my ideas, is not revealed, it's hidden. It almost beckons me because I'm involved in something that's very deep, and because I'm involved in something very deep, I'm sensing something even deeper. But when I'm sensing something which is even deeper, it's hidden from the depth that I'm involved with. So if we accept this supposition, which is how the last few lines of Perek Tez Zayin discuss, that any time you're involved in anything completely, there is a light that comes along with that involvement. On the highest levels, the light that comes along with that involvement is a hidden light. You have it and you don't even know what you have. And that's sort of the last component of the explanation of the concept of the unknowable oitze which the Eibishter gives us. Let's read Perek Tes, okay? We have in the Basi Ligani all that Rabbi mentioned by name. We just had the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid. Before that we had the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Marash and the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid. Now he brings the Rebbe Rashab. That the Beis on Yonim Shal Makef HaKarav and Makef HaRachin. Two ideas of an indirect light which is close to directness. An indirect light which is hidden from directness. Which is Makef, the Eriyosh, Makef, the Chazer, direct Makef, and direct Makef. So maybe Hamashal Shemavav Yemelu, the Rebbe Rashab brings the same mashal the previous Rebbe brought in this Perek we had earlier in this Mamer. Rav Mashpia Seichel Talmidim, teacher teaches the students. So there's 3 levels: what the teacher gives, what the teacher doesn't give that the student is going to get, and what the teacher doesn't give that the student is never going to get. The aim makes Seichel Zed, the depth of this idea, and the student cannot get directly Nisha B'chinas Makif if it's hidden from the student, but eventually will reach it mamish. After 40 years, because it's a makav hakodev. It's hidden from the student, but hidden from the student in the kind of way that tomorrow the student is going to get it. Is in a higher level, what remains by the teacher, which the student is never going to get, which is the idea of makav harochik. Says the Rebbe, this is all the same ideas that the previous Rebbe had in his Perek. We talked about at length earlier in this Mamer. So the Rebbe Afal became still the level of idea that the teacher has that the student doesn't get now and is not going to get later. The makif harochik, which the student doesn't get at all, also influences the student. Which is why, even though it's far, the fact that you call it makif means that although it's so far away from the student is never going to get it, but it has a relationship to what the student gets, which the Rebbe discussed at length in the 3rd shir on this Mamer. So he says, V'hine, amitis ha'inyan shal makav harochik, to be sure, the indirect makif is she'ein la talmud shum shaychas lazeh, the student is never going to get it. And even though the student is never going to get it, somehow he has it. And the explanation of how he has it is the whole arichas we had in the previous year about Ratzon and about Bayis and about Teira and about Chida. And in this year about Siburi, Maisis, Shebat Teira and the Derech Shlosh Hashem Nelech Bamidbar. Ve'ed Yes, and there's more. At the very, very end of the Perek, the previous Rebbe brings another mashal. And what's that mashal? That I feel when the teacher is pursuing these ideas by himself. The rule is when you're involved in something intellectual and you understand it, there's a light and a revelation that's not connected to what you're understanding, but it's connecting to the idea of intellectualism that fills you. So when you're learning something and you're understanding it, there is a light which is not part of what you're understanding, but it's part of the richness of learning. Says the Rebbe, when is this true? Because that kind of an idea, top of page Kuf Tzadik Zayin now, ideas that are revealed, ideas that can be understood. You understand the idea, and the reward for understanding the idea is a light which is higher than the idea, and the light which is higher than the idea enlightens you and the idea, which is all in the bechin of Eidin Seif bechin Lamatam Hatadin Tachas Shinani Gili. Says the Rebbe Aval, however, listen, Kasher Lei Mitzeichel Kazeh, when you study an idea which is sosul, which is secret, afamachter, and you're trying to what's the word? To solve a riddle. You start to figure out what's the secrets of the stories of the Torah. You choose to engage in understanding the Torah, which is so deep that it's completely secret and hidden. And if you're going to discover it, it's going to be through great effort and great loyalty, as I explained to you at great length in the introduction to today's class. Says the Rebbe, Shekol in Yonesh Yibehel. If you're deciding that you want to uncover the mystery and the secrets behind the stories of the Torah, if you decide that you want to uncover the mystery and the secrets of the chida, of the riddle, that's revealing in a most indirect way the highest secrets, but if you're able to solve that riddle, you will have those deeper secrets. Says the Rebbe, this is the idea of it in Seif. You're engaging in looking for godliness which you cannot find. And if and when you're going to find it, you're going to find it in an extremely indirect way, because directly you'll never get it. Hine, kishani teisif, when you pursue the secrets in the stories of the Torah, when you pursue the secrets in the riddles of the Torah, and you successfully solve the riddle, And in the mashal that I gave, you successfully figure out what's the halacha l'maisa, how we're supposed to do this mitzvah. So you have a takeaway from groping in the darkness of Teda. But the takeaway that you have is very, very far away from the light of the Teda per se, because this is called steam in the whole steam, and that light you'll never get, but you have something that you took away. And according to the principle that we just established, that anytime you learn anything, there is a light which is outside what you're learning, which accompanies your learning. So listen to the Rebbe's words. Kisheni Tesef, when you learn these deep mysteries and secrets, and you solve them, you solve the riddle, you solve the mystery of the stories of the Teda, and along with that comes an additional light. Listen, that additional light is also dark. You have a greater enlightenment, but the greater light that is not revealed, the light you get is a hidden light, hidden from you. In other words, when you go deep enough into the Teda, the enlightenment you get is that you sense something that's so deep that is hidden from you, and it makes you want to go into it, but you don't get it. So when you're studying the deeper secrets of the Teda, through the mechanisms described of trying to resolve a riddle and so on, as we discussed earlier in this class, and you get a secondary light, that secondary light is not enlightening, that secondary light is beckoning you into the deepest darkness. He's called Misala Batzmusi. And V'efshel L'kablam Kiyema De Mashut, only available through an allegory. So A, the only way to understand the idea is by resolving the mystery, the riddle. B, the secondary light which is available to you is not the kind of light which enriches you, which reveals itself to you, but creates an additional curiosity. It's drawing you deeper and deeper into hiddenness. Now, I don't have koyach pashat. I'm going on for a very long time. I don't have koyach at this hour of the night to explain this properly. But the nekud is, if you learn Chassidus, you find that Beklal, ideas are very deep. Ideas are very deep. And the deepest ideas sort of cross over from the realm of ideas to the realm of godliness, to the realm of pleasure, the realm of the neshama itself. And the deepest ideas don't come to you. You have to go to them. They're hidden from you, and you sort of go up into that hiddenness to have a sense of them. And this is the final point of Perek Tezayin, that not only is the riddle only available through deciphering the darkness, but the light that comes from resolving the riddle is also hidden. But there's a huge advantage in this. Parenthesis. It's explained in the Mamer of the Rabbi Ashab, which the Rebbe is referencing in other places. That when you understand an idea that can be understood, it's revealed. It's like the secondary light that you get is a trace of what the mind is. But it's not the essence of what the mind is, because that remains by the Rav. If you grab the idea through the mashal, although what you're getting is so secondary, but it's representing the truth of that idea as it truly is. And I truly do not know what I just said. I don't know. But I'm going to think, I'm going to suggest, I'm going to propose. Ahavona. In Hasidus, we talk about etzem and gilui, right? And I hate to use this word, but I'm going to use it because it's too late at night for me to be a nudnik. Essence and revelation. What's Helam and Gilui? What's etzem and gilui? What pashtas? There's a teacher, and there's a student, and there's a communication between the teacher and the student. Everything the teacher could teach the student and does teach the student is not the teacher, it's the lights of the teacher. The teacher himself is not the teachings. The teacher himself is above the teaching. And when a teacher communicates to his student, they communicates to his student his wisdom. And the student understands the wisdom of the teacher. When the student understands the wisdom of the teacher, he doesn't have the teacher, he has the teacher's wisdom. And to be sure, the wisdom of the teacher actually is hiding from the student who the teacher is himself. Is it possible that through ideas, a teacher can communicate himself? The student should not get a concept of the teacher, but the teacher himself. Now, how would you explain that in the language of Torah? How would you explain that in the language of Torah? In the language of Torah, you would explain that in the following way. Torah is Chochmah, Torah is Hashem's wisdom. But Torah, which is Hashem's Chochmah, carries Hashem's Ratzon, Hashem's will. The will is basically, and I'm using the word basically with advisement, mitzvahs. He wants us to do mitzvahs. When we study and understand the Torah, we have Hashem's light. When we extract from the Torah His will for us to do mitzvahs, the mitzvahs are actually more Him than the wisdom of the Torah that carried the mitzvahs, that delivered the mitzvahs to us. So what the Rebbe is saying, I think, is when the teacher teaches extremely deep ideas, that the only way for us to get them is through a very, very foreign medium of a mashal and a chida, of an allegory and a riddle and all those other things. And when we resolve the riddle, what do we have? What's the takeaway? The takeaway is something extremely lower than how that idea was in the original. But in that much lower version of the original, you have the teacher himself. Because although we're talking about ideas, the ideas that are the deepest in the teacher are the teacher. And I think that's how you translate these last words. Kol ha'inyan. Kol ha'inyan means the whole hiddenness. The whole hiddenness means the hiddenness of the teacher himself. Now, I'm not satisfied with this understanding. But it's going to have to do for now, at least, because it's 20 to 1 in the morning in New York, and I got to get up at 6 tomorrow. Okay, Rabbi Shmuel, now you can speak. I apologize for not letting you talk.
You don't have to apologize for that. I just wanted to point that don't we have a similar carve when we say that Torah is like mayim and that it flows down. So even though the mayim comes down to the bottom, it's talking about a pora and a shur and a this, that, and the other, and tzitzis in wool. But this reflects what it totally is. So since we can understand the metzias of those masholim, we have the whole thing, even though we don't understand the ruchnias. So isn't this comparable to the same idea that, menemt on the essence, right, through the mashal of what we know Begashmi as being the Pora or the tzitzis. So isn't that the same thing? And therefore, we have a mashal or we have a similarity to that. Or that's how I understood.
I think you're correct, except for one thing. That the Rebbe argues that halachas haTorah are seichel and never fully representative of etzem. Which is why he says the same idea you're saying, but not from the halachas, but from the sipurim. Which is really weird. It's really weird. Because the sipurim is pnimius haTorah. Pnimius haTorah really is giluyim. Halachas are mitzvahs haTorah. Mitzvahs haTorah are etzem. Here he's saying that if you dig deep enough in the stories, you literally have the Eibishter. even though the way we're accessing this story is through such a very, very indirect garment. In other words, we're resolving the riddle in an extremely low way relative to what the riddle represented in the beginning. But in that hiddenness, you have the hiddenness of the Eibishter himself. I think that's what he's saying. I don't know. I think that's what he's saying. But the good news and the bad news is that the Shir is officially over. And at 10 o'clock tonight, 10 o'clock Monday night, New York time, not 10:30, 10 o'clock, we're going to learn Perek Yud. Okay, I was supposed to give it in 4, the Mamer became 5. I knew a rabbi named Rabbi Wadowski. He passed away in Tufshin Samach, year 2000, 26 years ago. Shmuel Levi Yitzban Rav Levi Yitzchak. He was a senior mashpia in Machon Chana. They called him like the Zayd of Machon Chana. And I was a younger manchikel, and we became very good friends. We became very close. When he became ill, I used to visit him all the time. He lived near me, and I would visit him all. We became extremely, extremely close. And he told me a lot of wonderful things. And one of the things he told me was that his life was a journey through 4 worlds. He started out as a Talmud of Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner in Yeshivat Chaim Berlin. He was mamish a Talmud of his, and he talked about his Sfarim. I forgot the name of his Sfarim. Yitzchak. Then he became close to the Kloisenberger Rebbe. Pachad Yitzchak. Then he became close to the Skalener Rebbe. And then he ended up in Lubavitch. And to him it was like 4 steps in a journey. And he used to say that he never left anything behind. What he learned in his earlier stages became a part of who he was, and he incorporated them into who he became. So he would tell stories about the Kloisenberger Rebbe and about the Skalener Rebbe. Everything very positive. So he tells me a story. The Kloisenberger Rebbe was going to be a Sandik at a bris. And Rabbi Wadowski was asked to pick him up and bring him to the bris. I don't know if it was in Brooklyn or it was in Monsey, it doesn't matter. Anyway, he drives his car to the Kloisenberger Rebbe's place of residence. And the Heilige Kloisenberger Rebbe was a real tzaddik, no one's going to debate that, climbs into the back seat of his car and asks him, half in jest, Dib is the manig, which means technically you're the driver, but literally manig means the leader. Dib is the manig. So Rabbi Wadowski said, I heard myself say, he didn't mean to say it because he considered himself a chazir at that time of the Kloisenberger Rebbe. Führen kann ich nicht, aber führen will ich nicht. I cannot lead, but I will not mislead. I'm not going to take you any place special, but I'm not going to take you to a bad place either. The Kloisenberger Rebbe got so excited. The whole way to the bris, he was bringing in the car, that in this generation, that's a real leader. If you don't mislead, Mr. Sheina Manik. We exhausted this Maimit, and this Maimit exhausted us. I don't think ich hab geführt. Ich hoffe, als ich hab nicht verführt. A good Nacht, a good Morgen, a good Nachmittag. Everybody in their own continent, in their own time zone, thank you for being there. It means the world to me. Okay, Kol Tov.